Part 1, The Night Shift. Clara had worked at St. Teresa's Hospital for nearly 5 years. The quiet hum of fluorescent lights, the soft beep of patient monitors, and the faint rustling of staff moving through the hallways had all become a part of her routine. Yet, there was something about the late-night shifts that unsettled her. Maybe it was the isolation. Or perhaps the fact that during these hours, the hospital felt more like a mausoleum than a place of healing. Tonight, Clara was assigned to the night shift in the intensive care unit. It was a shift she dreaded more than any other. The patients here were always in critical condition, their lives hanging in the balance. Some would make it through, others wouldn't. But it was the silence, the eerie stillness that gnawed at her the most. She entered the ICU and was immediately struck by the cold, sterile atmosphere. The dull green walls and the constant hum of machines filled the air, but it wasn't the kind of hum you could grow accustomed to. No, it was a sound that always seemed to echo in your head long after you left. Clara checked the patient charts, noting that several of her charges were unconscious or sedated. She moved from one bed to the next, administering medications and adjusting IVs, but her mind kept wandering back to a particular patient, room 213. The patient in that room, Mr. Ashford, had been there for over a week now, recovering from a serious car accident. His prognosis was uncertain, and the doctors had warned Clara that his condition could take a turn for the worse at any moment. There was something about the man's stillness that unnerved her. His once vibrant features were now pale, almost ghostly, and his eyes were always half open, fixed on some distant point that no one else could see. Tonight, however, something felt different. As Clara entered room 213, she noticed that the heart monitor for Mr. Ashford had gone silent. The screen flickered once before it emitted a sharp, steady beep, the kind of sound you never want to hear in a hospital. Clara rushed to his side, her heart racing. "Mr. Ashford," she called, her voice trembling. But there was no response. She checked his pulse, and to her surprise, it was steady, too steady, almost unnaturally so. The air around her seemed to grow colder as she stood there, trying to make sense of the situation. Her hands shook as she adjusted the monitor and rechecked his vitals. Still, there was no change. Suddenly, she heard a soft whisper, a voice that sounded as though it came from the farthest corner of the room. "Help me, Clara." Clara froze, her breath catching in her throat. She looked around, but the room was empty, save for the patient in the bed. She must have imagined it, she thought. After all, the ICU was a place where your mind could easily play tricks on you during the long hours of the night. But then the voice came again, clearer this time, though it still had that distant quality to it. "Help me, Clara." Her heart raced. She turned to face Mr. Ashford, his eyes wide open, but still unseeing. A chill ran down her spine. The whispers continued, growing louder with each passing second, until it sounded like 100 voices all pleading at once. Clara stumbled backward, her back hitting the cold, metal bed rail. She tried to scream, but no sound came from her mouth. Instead, her hands found the call button, and she pressed it repeatedly, desperately. Within seconds, the door to the room burst open. Dr. Hale, one of the senior physicians, rushed in, his face full of concern. "What's going on, Clara?" he asked, looking from her to the patient. I heard something," she stammered, unable to form a coherent thought. "It's him. He's calling my name." Dr. Hale raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Ashford is sedated. There's no way he could speak." "But Clara began, but her words faltered as she looked down at the patient. Mr. Ashford's eyes were still locked onto hers, but now they seemed different. There was something in them. Something dark. Dr. Hale followed her gaze, his expression turning serious. He moved closer to the bed, his fingers brushing over Mr. Ashford's wrist to check his pulse. Then, without warning, he looked up at Clara, his face pale. "Get out of here. Now." Clara felt a cold shiver run through her as she stumbled backward, unsure of what was happening. Dr. Hale turned to the nurse's station and called for additional help, his voice terse. But Clara couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had just begun. As she left the room, her eyes lingered on Mr. Ashford, whose gaze never wavered from her. It was as though he was waiting. Waiting for something, or someone. Clara could feel the weight of it, that sensation that something was wrong, something that couldn't be explained by medical science. But she couldn't ignore the whispers, the voices in the air that seemed to follow her. Part 2, The Watcher. Clara couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It wasn't just the weight of Mr. Ashford's gaze lingering on her mind, it was something deeper, something insidious. Even as she walked the sterile, empty corridors of St. Teresa's, she could feel the oppressive presence of eyes on her back. She kept glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see someone there, but the hallway remained eerily empty. She tried to push it out of her mind as she continued her rounds, checking on other patients. But the nagging feeling refused to leave. Every time she passed a reflective surface, she swore she saw someone standing just behind her, a tall figure with a shadowy face. But when she turned around, there was never anyone there. By the time her shift came to an end, Clara was exhausted. Her eyes burned from lack of sleep, and her nerves were frayed. She couldn't remember a time when she had felt more on edge. She gathered her things and left the ICU, eager to escape the hospital's haunting silence. But just as she reached the parking garage, a sudden noise stopped her dead in her tracks. A faint tapping sound echoed through the concrete walls. It was coming from somewhere behind her. She spun around, her heart pounding, but again, there was nothing. The sound persisted, now louder and more rhythmic, like someone knocking on a door. Clara looked around in confusion. There were no cars in the garage, no one else was nearby. She pulled her coat tighter around herself and walked briskly toward her car, trying to ignore the unsettling noise. When she finally reached her vehicle, she hesitated before opening the door. A shadow flickered in the corner of her vision, and she instinctively turned to look. There, standing just outside the garage, was a man, a tall, gaunt figure dressed in a dark suit. His face was obscured by the shadows, but Clara could feel his eyes on her, even from the distance. She didn't recognize him, but the way he stood, unmoving, sent a wave of panic through her. Her hand trembled as she unlocked the car door, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from him. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It was as though he were waiting. Clara quickly got into her car, locking the doors behind her. She started the engine, her heart racing as she glanced in the rearview mirror. The man was still there, standing motionless, his face hidden in shadow. She drove out of the garage with her hands gripped tightly on the wheel, heart hammering in her chest. She couldn't shake the image of the figure standing there, watching her every move. As she navigated the dark streets on her way home, her thoughts drifted back to room 213, the whispers, the cold presence. It was as though the hospital's strange energy had followed her home. When Clara finally arrived at her apartment, she did her best to shake off the unease that had settled in her bones. She took a long shower, hoping to wash away the dread that clung to her. But even as the hot water streamed down, she could still hear the whispers, faint and distant, echoing in her mind. That night, as Clara lay in bed, sleep refused to come. Her eyes darted to the clock on her nightstand, 3:13 a.m. She tossed and turned, her mind racing with images of Mr. Ashford's lifeless eyes and the strange figure in the parking garage. Eventually, she drifted into a restless sleep, but it was no relief. In her dreams, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. She found herself back at the hospital, standing in front of room 213. The door creaked open on its own, and Clara stepped inside. The room was darker than she remembered, the air thick with an unnatural chill. Mr. Ashford lay in his bed, but his eyes were wide open, fixed on her. "Clara," the voice whispered, sending chills down her spine. "You shouldn't have left." She tried to move, to run, but her legs wouldn't obey. The shadows in the room began to shift, twisting and contorting into shapes that didn't belong. The whispers became a cacophony, 100 voices all crying out for help, for release. Suddenly, Clara felt a hand on her shoulder, cold, skeletal. She spun around, but there was no one there. Only the shadows, moving closer, creeping around her like tendrils. She gasped for air, trying to scream, but the words wouldn't come. Then, a familiar voice broke through the chaos. Clara. It was Dr. Hale. She turned to face him, but his face was pale, his eyes sunken, as though he had aged years in just a few days. He reached out to her, his hand trembling. "It's not over," he said, his voice hollow. "You can't escape it. You can't escape him." Clara's eyes widened as she watched Dr. Hale's face twist in agony. He opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. Instead, his body crumpled to the floor in a heap of shadow and dust. And then the whispers stopped. Clara awoke with a start, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Her body was drenched in sweat, her heart pounding in her chest. She sat up in bed, looking around her darkened apartment, half expecting to see the shadowy figure standing in the corner. But the room was empty. For now. Part 3, The Unseen Hand. The next morning, Clara barely had time to recover from the nightmare. The shadows that clung to her sleep seemed to follow her throughout the day, refusing to let her go. She kept glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see the tall figure in the parking garage or the ghostly eyes of Mr. Ashford waiting behind every corner. But what troubled her the most was the phone call she received just before leaving for work. The caller had no name on the ID. The voice was familiar, but distorted, like it was coming through a filter. It was unmistakably Dr. Hale's voice, though it sounded strange, almost like he was speaking from a great distance. "Clara. Don't trust them." His words sent a jolt of dread down her spine. "They're all." The line went dead before he could finish. Her hands trembled as she hung up the phone, staring at the receiver in disbelief. It didn't make sense. Dr. Hale had been acting strange the night before, but this was something else entirely. She quickly dialed the hospital's main line, asking to speak with him, but they told her he hadn't come in that day. The unease settled deep into her gut. Something was terribly wrong, but Clara couldn't put her finger on it. When she arrived at St. Teresa's, she was greeted by an eerie stillness that seemed to permeate the halls. The staff went about their business in a robotic, emotionless fashion, their faces blank. It felt as though she were the only person truly alive in the hospital, and even her own thoughts seemed muffled, like the walls were closing in. Clara headed straight for the ICU, determined to focus on her work, but she couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread that followed her. As she walked through the hallway leading to room 213, she paused. For a moment, she thought she heard someone whispering her name. Clara. It was a voice she knew too well, the same one from her dreams. The one that called to her, pleading for help. She turned, her heart in her throat, but once again, the hallway was empty. Panic crept up her spine. She couldn't ignore it any longer. She had to go to room 213. When she reached the door, it was ajar, the dim light inside casting strange shadows across the floor. Clara stepped in cautiously, her pulse quickening. Mr. Ashford was still in his bed, his eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. The machines beeped rhythmically, but there was something different about him, something cold. The air in the room seemed to thicken, and she could almost feel an invisible weight pressing down on her chest. "Mr. Ashford," she murmured, walking closer to the bed. "How are you feeling today?" No response. Her fingers hovered over the controls of his four-drip, but before she could make any adjustments, a sharp voice cut through the silence. "Don't touch him." Clara whirled around. Dr. Hale stood in the doorway, his eyes wide with fear. His face was pale, and his breathing was labored, as though he had run a great distance. "Dr. Hale. I didn't know you were back," Clara stammered, confused. His gaze darted toward Mr. Ashford's bed before locking eyes with Clara. There was something frantic in his expression, something desperate. "Clara, you don't understand," he said, his voice shaking. You don't know what he is. Before she could ask what he meant, Dr. Hale stepped forward, his hand grabbing her arm with surprising strength. Listen to me. The man in that bed is not who you think he is. He's not human. No one is allowed to go near him. Not you. Not anyone. Clara's mind raced. This couldn't be happening. Was he delirious? Dr. Hale, you're scaring me, she said, trying to pull away. Please, what are you talking about? He glanced over his shoulder, as if expecting someone, or something, to appear. The fear in his eyes deepened. They've been watching me, he whispered, barely audible. They've been watching all of us. Clara felt a cold shiver run through her. Who? Who's been watching you? He didn't answer. Instead, his gaze flickered once more toward Mr. Ashford. The patient's eyes shifted, slowly, almost imperceptibly, toward them. The motion was unsettling, unnatural. Clara's breath caught in her throat. Get out of here. Now, Dr. Hale hissed, his grip tightening. I'll cover for you. Just, leave. Clara hesitated. She wanted to argue, to demand answers, but she could see in Dr. Hale's face that something terrible was about to happen, something far beyond her understanding. The desperation in his eyes made her stomach churn with a mix of fear and confusion. Without another word, she nodded and backed away, her heart pounding in her chest. She turned toward the door, but as she reached for the handle, something caught her eye. It was Mr. Ashford, his hand, reaching toward her. His fingers twitched, then curled into a slow, deliberate grasp, as though inviting her closer. Clara froze, paralyzed by a sensation she couldn't name. It was as though his hand wasn't just an appendage anymore. It was a living, breathing thing, an extension of something darker, something waiting. And then, as if in response to her shock, the lights in the room flickered and dimmed. The whispers returned, faint at first, then growing louder. The walls seemed to vibrate with a terrible, unearthly hum. Clara turned back to Dr. Hale, but he was gone. The room was empty except for her and Mr. Ashford, whose eyes now gleamed with an unnatural, almost predatory gleam. Clara's heart slammed against her ribcage, and she felt the grip of unseen hands closing around her, pulling her into the shadows. Part 4, The Calling. Clara's breath came in shallow gasps as she stumbled backward, her eyes locked on Mr. Ashford's unblinking stare. His hand was still outstretched, but now his fingers curled in a slow, deliberate motion, like something seeking her attention, beckoning her forward. The whispers surged in volume, twisting and overlapping into a haunting chorus. Clara. Come closer, you belong here. Her pulse raced as she jerked her gaze away from the bed. The room seemed to contract around her, suffocating her in its cold, sterile air. Her mind screamed at her to run, but her body wouldn't obey. It felt as though the walls themselves were pushing her in, urging her closer to the bed, to Mr. Ashford, to the thing that lurked within him. With every step she took toward the door, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. Her own name was repeated over and over, a chant, a command. Clara. The air felt thick, viscous, and she could no longer tell if the sensation was coming from inside her mind or if it was the room itself pushing against her. A bead of sweat dripped down her forehead, but she wiped it away quickly, still backing toward the door. But just before she could reach the handle, something cold and damp brushed against her ankle. She gasped and looked down, but there was nothing there. Only shadows. She looked back at Mr. Ashford, and in that fleeting moment, the shadows in the room seemed to shift. His hand, once resting lifelessly at his side, was now inches from the floor. The fingertips brushed against the floorboards as if searching for something. Something or someone. Clara turned on her heel, her legs shaking beneath her, and finally, she bolted for the door, yanking it open with all her strength. As she stepped out into the hall, she was nearly blinded by the bright fluorescent lights. The shrill beeping of heart monitors echoed in the distance, and the harsh smell of antiseptic filled her nostrils. She didn't stop running until she reached the nurse's station. Her breath came in ragged bursts, her chest tight with fear. She slammed her palms down on the counter, startling a few of the nurses who were filling out reports. One of them, a younger woman named Sophie, looked up in concern. "Clara, what's wrong?" Sophie asked, her brow furrowing. Clara tried to calm herself, but the words wouldn't come. She struggled to breathe, to make sense of what had just happened. Her mind was a mess of fragmented images, the hand reaching out to her, the whispers, the way the air in room 213 had felt alive, suffocating. "Sophie, something is wrong with room 213, Clara managed to say, her voice trembling. "The patient, he's not who he appears to be. I think he's something else." Sophie's face softened, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Clara, you're exhausted. Maybe you need a break. The night shifts are tough, especially the ones in the ICU." "No," Clara said, shaking her head violently. "No, you don't understand. You have to listen to me. There's something wrong with him, Anne." Her words were cut off as the lights in the nurse's station flickered. The overhead fluorescent bulbs buzzed for a moment, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. Clara's breath came out in visible puffs as a sudden chill overtook her. Sophie glanced around nervously. "It's probably just a power surge or something. You know how old this building is." But her words trailed off as she looked toward the hallway, her expression slowly changing to one of confusion. "Did you hear that?" Sophie whispered. Clara's heart skipped a beat as the soft, distant whispering came again, this time unmistakably clear. It was as if 100 voices were echoing down the hallway, all calling her name, chanting it in an endless loop. "Clara! Clara, come back!" Sophie's eyes widened in horror, her hand gripping the counter tightly. "Who's there?" she called into the hallway. "Who's talking?" There was no answer. Only the faint sound of something moving, shuffling feet, perhaps. But the whispering continued, filling the air, growing louder, more insistent. Clara's pulse raced. She grabbed Sophie's arm. "We have to get out of here," she said, her voice barely a whisper, her throat dry. Sophie nodded quickly, but before either of them could move, the overhead lights flickered again and went completely dark. A cold, bone-chilling darkness enveloped the hallway. Clara felt a pressure, like a hand pressing against her chest, and suddenly, she couldn't breathe. Her vision blurred, and for a split second, she felt as though she were sinking into the floor itself. Then, a voice, soft but unmistakably clear, came from the darkness. "Clara! You can't run from me." Her blood ran cold as she turned toward the voice. It was coming from the direction of room 213. She couldn't move. She couldn't scream. Every fiber of her being screamed to flee, but her feet remained frozen in place. Something was drawing her back. Something in that room, something that wasn't human. The last thing she saw before the darkness completely consumed the hallway was the faint outline of a figure standing at the far end, just outside room 213. It was tall, too tall, and its shadow stretched far longer than it should have. And then, nothing. Part 5, The Descent. When Clara opened her eyes, she found herself standing in a darkened hallway. The lights flickered above her in a desperate attempt to stay on, casting long, jagged shadows against the sterile white walls. The silence felt suffocating, too quiet, too empty. It was as though the entire hospital had been swallowed by the darkness. Her heart raced, but her feet remained rooted to the spot. She couldn't move, couldn't speak, as if an invisible force had frozen her in place. The whispers from before had ceased, but the weight of the silence was worse. It pressed against her chest, squeezing the air from her lungs. "Clara!" The voice came again, this time softer, almost soothing. She gasped, her head jerking toward the sound. The hallway before her stretched into infinity, the shadows flickering like twisted hands reaching out from the corners. But at the far end, just before room 213, there was a figure. The same tall, dark silhouette she had seen before. It was more defined now, more tangible. The shape of a man, but not entirely. Clara's body refused to move. She felt paralyzed, as if her every thought was being sucked away, pulled into the abyss of that presence. Her heart thundered in her chest, but no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't scream. She couldn't call for help. The figure took a slow step toward her, its head tilting slightly to the side, as if it were studying her. The shadows around it seemed to pulse, a ripple of darkness that stretched and undulated with every step the figure took. "Clara," the voice again, this time with a familiar, almost affectionate tone. "You've been chosen." Chosen? Clara's breath hitched. The words made no sense. Chosen for what? She forced her legs to move, her body screaming at her to run, but the darkness seemed to pull at her, holding her in place as though it were a living thing, a predator closing in on its prey. The figure took another step. And another. Closer. Closer. It reached the edge of the flickering light, and Clara could finally make out its features. The face was obscured by shadows, but she could see enough, a pale, elongated face with hollow eyes. A smile stretched across the face, but it was wrong, too wide, too unnatural. The figure reached out, a skeletal hand emerging from the darkness. Clara wanted to scream, to flee, but all that escaped her was a strangled gasp. She could feel the cold air around the figure, the pressure building in the room as though the very space were warping, bending, contorting to accommodate it. "Help me." "Clara," the figure whispered, its voice now dripping with malice. "You were always meant to help me." Clara's pulse pounded in her ears, her head spinning. There was something in its voice, something that knew her, something that made her skin crawl. The cold hand reached forward, brushing against her cheek, and the moment it touched her skin, an electric shock ran through her entire body. Her vision blurred, and the world around her warped. She blinked, and suddenly, she was no longer standing in the hallway. She was back in room 213. Mr. Ashford lay in the bed, his eyes still open, unblinking, his pale skin almost translucent in the dim light. The machines beeped, but the room felt wrong. The shadows that had once been contained within the walls now seemed to stretch, to swirl around her. The air tasted metallic, thick with the scent of decay. "No," Clara whispered, stumbling back. "No, no, no." A cold hand closed around her wrist, yanking her forward. She turned, expecting to see nothing, but the figure was there, looming over her, its face mere inches from hers. Its breath was icy, its eyes black voids that seemed to suck all the light from the room. "Clara," it purred, the voice now rich with hunger. "You've always known, haven't you? You've always known what's been waiting here." Clara's head spun. She had known, deep down, she had always known. The coldness. The whispers. The eyes that followed her, the unnatural presence in the ICU. She had seen it all, felt it in her bones, but had been too afraid to face the truth. Now, the truth was staring her in the face. The figure smiled, a grotesque, twisted smile. "I've been watching you. You're the one who will set me free." It wasn't just a man. It was a thing, an entity, a force that had been waiting, growing, feeding. Clara wasn't just its victim. She was its key. "Clara," it whispered again, but this time the voice wasn't in her ears. It was in her mind. "It's time to choose." The walls seemed to close in on her, and the room became darker, the shadows swallowing everything in sight. Clara's knees buckled as the weight of the figure's presence pressed against her chest. It was suffocating. Her vision faded, the world going black as she felt herself being drawn into the abyss. She was no longer in the hospital. She was in a void, dark and endless, a place where time didn't exist, where nothing made sense. The figure was still there, its presence consuming her, pulling her closer to something terrible, something ancient. And then, she heard it again. A voice, not from the figure, but from somewhere deep within her. "Clara. You have to make a choice." Part 6, The Choice. Clara's mind spun in the darkness, a swirling maelstrom of confusion and terror. Her heart pounded in her chest, the rhythm erratic, as though it might stop altogether. She tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. The void around her was suffocating, cold, and endless. And yet, amidst the overwhelming silence, that voice came again. Clara. You must choose. The words weren't spoken aloud. They weren't even heard through her ears. They were inside her mind, twisting and worming their way into her consciousness, pulling her deeper into a place where nothing was real and everything was possible. For a moment, Clara didn't know where she was. Was she still at St. Teresa's hospital? Was she asleep, trapped in some nightmarish fever dream, or had she crossed into something far worse? She tried to focus, to regain control, but everything around her kept shifting. Shapes began to emerge from the darkness, shadows of twisted figures, half-formed, flickering in and out of existence. Some were human, some not. Some were merely shapes, silhouettes that lurked at the edge of her vision, just out of reach. Clara, listen carefully, the voice continued, now colder, more insistent. The time has come. You will choose, your life, or mine. Clara's breath hitched. Her life or his? She didn't understand. What did that mean? Who was the voice? What did it want from her? And then, the figure appeared again, stepping out from the darkness like a shadow made flesh. It was no longer just a man. It was something far worse, an entity, an ancient force, a being of pure hunger and darkness. Its face remained hidden in shadow, but Clara could feel its eyes on her, watching, waiting. Its presence loomed, suffocating. I have waited for so long, the figure whispered. I am the one who walks between the worlds. I feed on the forgotten. I consume the lost. And now, you will choose whether you will remain in the light or descend into darkness with me. Clara staggered backward, her legs weak beneath her, but she couldn't escape. The ground beneath her feet was soft, like liquid, as if the entire world were shifting and bending. The figure's voice grew louder, the pressure building around her until it felt as though her very bones were being crushed. Clara, it's time. You've seen the truth now. You know who I am. Clara closed her eyes, trying to block out the crushing weight of the figure's presence. But the images came flooding back, room 213, the whispers, the shadowy figure in the parking garage, Mr. Ashford's cold, lifeless eyes. The thing that had been hiding in plain sight, feeding off the hospital, feeding off her. I can't, Clara whispered, her voice trembling. I don't know what you want from me. I can't choose. The figure laughed, a low, guttural sound that echoed through her skull. You already have, Clara. You have already made your choice the moment you walked into this place. You chose when you took that first step into room 213. And now, the consequences are yours to bear. Clara's vision blurred, the world around her swirling. She could hear her own heartbeat thudding in her ears, louder and louder, until it was all she could focus on. A sharp pain shot through her chest, and she gasped, clutching at her heart. Something inside her, something, was trying to break free. She could feel it inside her, like a dark, gnawing force crawling beneath her skin. Let go, the figure whispered. Let me in, and we will be one. Clara shook her head, her throat constricting. No. No, I won't. I won't let you take me. But the figure wasn't done. It reached out, its hand stretching impossibly far, until it was right in front of her face. The fingers, long, cold, and twisted, hovered just above her skin, and Clara could feel the cold seep into her bones, an icy touch that made her want to scream. Clara. You have no choice. You were always meant for this. You are the key. You are the door. Before she could react, the figure's hand slammed into her chest. A jolt of agony shot through her body, her breath stolen as the world around her went white, then black. When Clara opened her eyes again, she was back in the ICU, in room 213. But this time, the room felt different. It felt alive. The air was thick, charged with an unnatural energy. The machines around Mr. Ashford beeped erratically, as if struggling to contain the force inside the room. Mr. Ashford was still lying in his bed, but his eyes were no longer lifeless. They were wide open, but they were black, voids of inky darkness that seemed to pull Clara in, swallowing her whole. And then, she saw it, the thing that had been hiding all this time. The shadow that had been waiting to break free. It crawled out from Mr. Ashford's body. It was monstrous, a writhing, dark mass, a shape with too many limbs, too many eyes, too many mouths. It was a thing made of shadows, born of nightmares, and it was no longer content to hide. The figure from the void stood behind it, watching her with its hollow, unblinking gaze. The corners of its mouth twisted into a grin. "Clara," it said softly, but now the voice wasn't just inside her head. It was in the room with her, filling the air, echoing off the walls. "You've chosen. Now, let's see what you've become." Part 7, The Awakening. Clara's heart pounded against her ribs, each beat thudding like a drum, but it wasn't enough to drown out the overwhelming presence in the room. Her body felt numb, detached from reality, as though she were a mere observer in her own skin. The thing that had once been Mr. Ashford, or perhaps had always been him, was now fully revealed, an abomination of flesh and shadow, writhing in the bed. Its limbs twisted and jerked as though they were caught in a perpetual dance of torment, stretching unnaturally long, far beyond the limits of human form. Its skin was a tangle of dark tendrils, and its many eyes blinked rapidly, the black voids of its gaze never leaving Clara. The mouths, jagged and wide, opened and closed with a sickening sound that made her stomach turn. It was no longer just a creature. It was alive, and it was hungry. Clara could feel it, the pull, the draw from the thing in front of her. It wasn't just feeding on her fear anymore, it was feeding on something deeper, something inside her that she couldn't quite understand. A deep, gnawing emptiness that had always been there, buried beneath the surface, now brought to life by this creature, this thing that had somehow linked with her soul. The figure behind it, the dark entity with the hollow eyes and twisted smile, moved closer, its shadow stretching across the floor. Its long, skeletal fingers reached out toward her, and the air around her seemed to vibrate with some ancient power. "Do you understand now, Clara?" the figure purred, its voice a smooth, sickening blend of seduction and malice. "Do you see what you've become?" Clara opened her mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. It felt as though something was choking her, squeezing the air from her lungs. She gasped, but only a strangled breath escaped her. "You are the key," the figure continued, its voice now wrapping around her like a snake, constricting. "The door has been opened, and there is no going back. You and I, we are one now. We are connected by this dark power. And now, you will be the vessel. The one who carries the burden of the forgotten." Clara's knees buckled, and she collapsed to the ground, her hands shaking as she tried to push herself up. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. The weight of the presence in the room pressed down on her, dragging her deeper into despair. The shadowy figure stepped forward, and as it did, the air seemed to warp, thickening with an unnatural chill. Clara could feel it in the marrow of her bones, the coldness seeping in, spreading through her veins. "Do you feel it?" the figure whispered, its breath freezing her skin. "The power coursing through you? The hunger? The darkness?" Clara's vision blurred, and for a moment, she thought she saw her own reflection in the glass of the ICU window. Her eyes were black, voids of emptiness. But when she looked back, she realized the reflection was gone. It wasn't her anymore. Not entirely. The creature, no, the thing, on the bed let out a low, gurgling growl. Its body began to twitch violently, its tendrils flailing in all directions, as though it were trying to free itself from some invisible restraint. The ground beneath Clara's feet vibrated with the intensity of its movement. "You see," the figure said, moving even closer, "this is what I have been waiting for. I am bound by this world, by this hospital, by the flesh I inhabit. But you, Clara. You are free. You are not bound by the same rules. You can walk between the worlds. You can be my conduit. Clara's vision darkened as her pulse quickened. A sharp pain shot through her chest, and she felt as though she were being torn apart from the inside. The thing in front of her reached out, its tendrils swirling around her, pulling her toward it, and she couldn't resist. She felt as though her very soul was being dragged into the abyss. She heard a voice, Dr. Hale's voice, faint but clear, as though it were coming from the farthest corner of her mind. Clara, fight it. Don't let it take you. But it was too late. The figure was too powerful now. The hunger that had been growing inside her, feeding off her fear and her confusion, had awakened. It had merged with her, become part of her. And now, there was no going back. You were always meant to serve me, the figure hissed, its hand now resting on her shoulder. You are my chosen one. Together, we will feast on the forgotten. Together, we will spread the darkness. Clara could feel the coldness inside her, the power of the creature surging through her veins. She wanted to fight, wanted to scream, but she couldn't. The creature's presence consumed her, flooded her mind with whispers of madness and hunger. The room around her began to warp and distort. The walls stretched and twisted as though they were alive, pulsating with a rhythm that mirrored her own racing heartbeat. The lights flickered, and the air grew thick, almost suffocating. And then, Clara saw it. A crack in the wall. At first, it was barely visible, a faint line, like a scar on the fabric of reality. But as she stared at it, the crack grew wider, revealing a glimpse of something beyond. The space behind the wall was dark, impossibly dark, and Clara could feel something on the other side, something waiting, just beyond reach. The figure noticed her gaze and smiled. Yes. You are seeing it now. The rift between worlds. The threshold. Clara's heart raced as the realization hit her. This wasn't just about Mr. Ashford, or the hospital, or even the entity in front of her. It was about something much bigger. Something older. The rift was a doorway to the darkness. And Clara was the key. Come, Clara, the figure beckoned, its voice now full of hunger. Step through the threshold with me. Join me on the other side. There is nothing left for you here. Clara's hand trembled as it reached for the rift. The darkness beckoned to her, promising power, freedom, and endless hunger. But deep down, a part of her, the part that was still human, fought to break free. Part 8, The Choice, Reversed. Clara's hand hovered above the rift. The darkness beyond it pulsed with a cold, oppressive force, its tendrils reaching toward her as if it could taste her fear, taste her hesitation. Her heartbeat thudded in her ears, but beneath that, a voice, a familiar voice, called to her. Clara. It was Dr. Hale. The warmth of his voice, so clear and steady, broke through the fog in her mind. It felt like a lifeline, pulling her back from the abyss. She could hear him, see his face in her mind's eye, his kind, steady gaze that had always been a source of comfort amidst the chaos of the hospital. Clara, don't listen to it, he urged, his voice now an echo, faint but unmistakable. This is not your path. You are not the key, you are not its vessel. You have a choice, fight. Clara's breath hitched, and she forced her eyes shut, trying to block out the overwhelming presence of the dark figure that loomed before her, its hollow eyes still fixed on her every move. Don't fight me, the figure whispered, the voice now dripping with venom. You cannot escape what you've become. You are mine. This is your destiny. But Clara wasn't listening. She clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms as a surge of clarity ripped through her like a lightning bolt. The darkness, it was not hers. She had let it in, let it worm its way into her mind, into her soul, but she had the power to push it out. The rift behind her grew wider, the darkness beckoning, whispering promises of power, immortality, a life without pain. But Clara could feel the remnants of her humanity stirring within her, fighting back against the allure of the void. No, she whispered, her voice hoarse but resolute. I won't. The figure's smile faltered for the first time. It took a step forward, its eyes narrowing as if it could sense her resistance. "You think you can defy me?" it hissed. "You think you can deny the inevitable?" Clara's vision blurred again, the room around her spinning as the force of the thing's presence pressed down on her like a vice. She could feel the coldness seep into her bones, the tendrils of the shadow curling around her body, tightening, suffocating. But she fought against it. She had to fight. "Clara," Dr. Hale's voice, distant yet clear, came again. "Focus, Clara. You are stronger than this. You are not alone." A jolt ran through her body, and Clara gasped, as though a spark had ignited deep within her. She could feel it now, the warmth of her humanity pushing back against the darkness. The tether to the world she knew, to the people she cared about, to everything she had once believed in. With a sharp breath, Clara reached into her mind, into the very core of her being, and pulled the darkness to the surface. She could feel it, twisting and slithering, a living thing inside her, but she clenched her teeth, refusing to let it take control. "I won't be your vessel," she snarled, her voice gaining strength, defiance rising like a tide. The figure hissed, its form flickering for a moment, its shape distorting as Clara's resistance began to weaken its hold over her. "You think you can break free?" the figure spat, its voice a low growl. "You are nothing without me. You are a hollow shell, an empty soul, and without me, you will wither." Clara didn't respond. She couldn't afford to listen to it anymore. She focused on the warmth, on the human essence within her that had once been so familiar, so comforting. She reached for it with every ounce of strength, feeling the darkness recoil, pulling away from the light inside her. And then, with a final surge of will, Clara pushed. The world around her seemed to collapse in on itself. The rift screamed, an eerie, hollow cry, as if it were being torn apart. The figure howled, its form warping and flickering like a dying flame. "No," it screeched. "No. You are mine, Clara. You belong to me." But Clara didn't relent. She wasn't the key anymore. She wasn't the doorway. She was Clara, and she had a choice. With one final, violent push, the darkness cracked. And the rift shattered. Clara awoke to light. Blinding, pure light. She gasped, her lungs filling with air, sharp and cold. Her body trembled, the remnants of the dark force still buzzing in her veins, but it was fading now, receding like a bad memory, like a nightmare that had finally been exorcised from her soul. The world around her was still. She was no longer in the ICU. She was standing outside. In the parking lot of St. Teresa's Hospital. The sky above was a pale, clear blue, and the sun shone brightly, warming her skin. The hum of passing traffic filled the air, the sounds of everyday life. Normal. Real. Safe. But Clara knew better now. She wasn't safe. Not yet. She glanced around, her heart still racing, but she didn't see the figure. The darkness was gone, for now. But she knew it wouldn't stay away forever. It would find her again. It always did. A figure approached from the corner of her vision. It was Dr. Hale. "Clara," he said, his voice soft but firm, as he came to a stop beside her. "You did it. You chose. But the battle's far from over." Clara nodded, feeling the weight of the words, of what had happened. She wasn't free. Not truly. The rift had been closed, but the darkness was still out there, still waiting, still hungry. But for now, she had won. And that was enough. Part 9, The Final Reckoning. Days had passed since Clara's final confrontation with the shadow that had consumed St. Teresa's Hospital. The weight in her chest had lifted, but she knew deep down that the peace she felt was temporary. The darkness she had expelled wasn't gone, it was simply waiting for the right moment, for a crack in her resolve. For the right time to return. Clara walked through the now empty halls of the hospital, her footsteps echoing in the silence. The hospital had changed. It wasn't just the lack of patience or the sense of abandonment, it was something deeper, something off. It was as though the place itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The walls felt cold, oppressive, and every corner she turned seemed darker than it should be. The lights flickered above her as she made her way toward the administrative offices, the sound of her heels clicking sharply against the linoleum floor. But it wasn't the atmosphere of the hospital that unnerved her, it was the feeling that she was being watched. That same cold sensation that had plagued her since her first night here, the feeling of something lurking in the shadows, waiting to pounce. Clara's fingers brushed against the edge of a doorframe as she passed, and for just a moment, she thought she saw movement in the corner of her eye. A shadow. A flicker. But when she turned to look, there was nothing there. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling. She reached Dr. Hale's office and knocked once, hesitantly. He called for her to enter, his voice warm, though there was an edge of concern in it now. "Clara," he said, looking up from the stack of papers on his desk. "I was hoping you'd come." Clara stepped inside, her heart still uneasy despite the calm in Dr. Hale's demeanor. "Is something wrong?" she asked, her voice low. Dr. Hale sighed, rubbing his temples before looking at her with a somber expression. "Clara. I need you to listen to me carefully. This is going to sound insane, but I've been researching something. The entity you encountered, the one you almost became, it's not just one creature. It's part of something much older. Something that feeds on the forgotten and the lost." Clara felt a chill creep up her spine. She wasn't sure whether she wanted to hear this, but she needed to know. "You said that the rift had closed," she said, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "That I won, that it was over." "You did," Dr. Hale replied, his voice tight. "But I don't think you've truly escaped it, Clara. The darkness doesn't just take one form. It adapts. It hides. It waits." Clara's pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" Dr. Hale leaned forward, his eyes shadowed with something like fear. "The hospital was built on an ancient site. A place where rituals were once performed, a place where dark things were worshipped. That entity, that creature you encountered, it's connected to that place. It was never meant to be freed. It's been waiting for centuries for someone like you to crack open the door." Clara's stomach churned. "So, what does that mean for me?" Dr. Hale stood, walking to the window, looking out as if considering how to frame his next words. "It means that, in a sense, you've become a part of it. You're a link now. It knows you. It knows your fear. And it won't stop until it finds a way to pull you back in." Clara's mind raced, and the weight of his words settled in her chest like a stone. She had thought she was free. But freedom was an illusion. She was never going to outrun this thing, this ancient darkness that had latched onto her soul. "You have to be ready," Dr. Hale continued, his voice low. "You can't let your guard down. The hospital is the epicenter, but the darkness can spread. It can reach far beyond these walls. I know you felt it, Clara. The shadow still follows you. It's only a matter of time before it comes for you again." Clara nodded slowly, a deep sense of dread pooling in her stomach. The truth was undeniable. The battle was far from over. The entity had seen her, and it wasn't done with her. "I don't know what to do," she whispered. "You need to stay vigilant," Dr. Hale said. "Stay connected to the light, to the people who care about you. It can't fully take you as long as you hold on to that. As long as you remember what you fought for." Clara felt the weight of his words, and yet, a part of her still didn't understand. How could she fight something like this? How could she ever escape? As she turned to leave, she caught a glimpse of herself in the glass window by the door. Her reflection seemed distorted, her eyes were no longer entirely hers. There was a flicker, a shadow in them, like something waiting to be awakened. She quickly turned away, heart racing. Just as she reached the door, she paused. A strange thought crossed her mind, a thought she couldn't ignore. What if, What if I was meant to be part of it? What if I can embrace it? Dr. Hale's voice was sharp when he answered. No, Clara. That's what it wants. It wants you to surrender, to let go. That's how it wins. Don't give it that. Clara hesitated. She didn't know if she could live like this, forever looking over her shoulder, never knowing when the darkness would return. But the thought of embracing it, of accepting her fate, was a temptation. A dangerous temptation. With a deep breath, Clara made her choice. She would keep fighting. Not just for herself, but for everyone who could still be saved. The battle with the darkness wasn't over. But it had to end her way. Clara turned to leave the office. But as the door clicked shut behind her, she could have sworn she heard the faintest whisper in the air. Clara, you're mine.